It is my honor to introduce Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. And today we have a newsy event. We're going to break some news here, we hope. And I know some of you are interested in writing about this. Mr. Roth is going to introduce the organization's new report on gender discrimination in job advertising in China. As the Me Too movement expands globally, the report looks into government and corporate recruitment practices that facilitate the creation of a workplace environment conducive to sexual harassment and discrimination. He's going to talk about the ads and what the report highlights in terms of gender discriminatory and sexually objectifying job ads published by Chinese technology companies with international listings and global ambitions. Mr. Roth is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. He has previously served as a federal prosecutor in New York and also for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and Brown University and has conducted numerous rights investigations and missions around the world. He will talk to us and show us a few of these ads, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. During the Q&A, we ask that you identify yourself and your organization. Thank you. Mr. Roth.
As you can tell, I'm here to present Human Rights Watch's latest report, Only Men Need Apply, Gender Discrimination in Job Advertisements in China. And this is a report that we've been working on for most of the last year. It is based on a review of 36,000 job ads that have been posted between 2013 and 2018. And it looks at Chinese recruitment and company websites as well as social media for both government and private jobs. And I'll get into some of the differences there in a moment. I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. You may have noticed that I'm a man. Now, why is a man presenting a report on gender discrimination in China? The answer is, one, it's an important problem. This is a problem that affects 700 million women. And so we thought it was appropriate for the director of Human Rights Watch to make this presentation. There's also, frankly, a tendency on the part of the Chinese government to treat human rights issues as somehow marginal, as only affecting minorities such as the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, or only the dissidents. And we want to stress, and that's one of the aims of this report, is that human rights should be and are an everyday concern for Chinese people. And that if you enable the government to violate the rights of certain minorities or certain disfavored people, you ultimately end up jeopardizing the rights of everybody. And that's an important message that I personally wanted to deliver. And frankly, it's wrong to think of gender discrimination as a concern only of women. And I, as a man, share a deep concern about this. So in a moment of Me Too, I want to say that I, too, am worried about gender discrimination. So that's why I'm here. That said, for security reasons, we are not putting forward publicly the woman who did this investigation. But we do have here a women's and labor rights activist, Zhang Jinyan, who will be available to speak and give you kind of a personal account should you like to speak with her. So that said, let me get into the findings first. What did we find here? Now, the good news is that Chinese law prohibits gender discrimination. China has also adopted treaties that prohibit gender discrimination. The bad news is that these laws are not being enforced, with the result that the kind of discrimination that you saw in these ads is rampant. Now, it's not simply, for lower level jobs. It in fact particularly comes up in more prestigious, better paying jobs where you tend to see the prevalence of this, men only, men preferred kind of advertising. And it is a problem that in many ways seems to be getting worse. So for example, when we looked at the Chinese National Civil Service job listings, in 2017, we found that 13%, 1-3, of the job postings specified men only, men preferred, suitable for men, those kinds of things. And this, included, for example, a posting for the Ministry of Public Security where it said, you need to work overtime frequently, it's high-intensity work, so only men need apply. And that kind of sexism tends to pervade these ads. So from 2017, with 13% of those job listings including this discriminatory language, in 2018 so far, it's worse. It's 19%. So essentially, 1 in 5 jobs listed for the National Civil Service, which are good jobs. These are secure jobs with benefits and jobs that are kind of a route to the middle class, are only open to men. Now, by contrast, none of the job listings that we saw in 2017 specified women only. And there was only one that we found in 2018. So this is not a both sides problem, it's a one-way problem. Now, the private Chinese companies are not doing much better, and particularly, as you saw in the video, the tech giants. So, for example, the search engine giant Baidu advertised a job in March of a year ago for content reviewers, stipulating that applicants must be men because they have to have the strong ability to work under pressure and be able to work on weekends, holidays, and night shifts. Obviously something that women could never do. So you get that kind of stuff. With the e-commerce conglomerate Alibaba, this past January, 4 months ago, they had an ad saying that they preferred men for 2 of their restaurant operations support specialist positions. Again, a job that couldn't possibly be done by a woman. So, it's just this kind of stuff pervades these ads. Now, why is this? At one level, this discriminatory language reflects a discriminatory view about women. There is this assumption, implicit or sometimes virtually explicit, that women are less intellectually or physically or psychologically capable than men. And there's also the view that women are not fully committed, that they're going to get married, that they're going to leave and have a family. And so it's not worth investing in them because they're going to go away or because you're going to have to pay maternity benefits or what have you. So these kinds of assumptions are sort of the rationalizations behind this sort of discrimination. Now, this is having an effect. If you look at, for example, female labor force participation, it is down over the last decade from 65.5% to 63%. If you look at the gender gap in labor force participation, that is to say, a comparison between the rate of participation of men and the rate of participation of women, in a decade ago, in 2007, that gap was 83%, and it has now dropped to 81%. So these are, a gradual decline. In many ways, the most dramatic difference is when you start looking at China with respect to its peers around the world. And if you look at the World Economic Forum's analysis of gender parity, China's ranking is going down and down and down. Over the last decade, it has gone from being China in 57th place out of the roughly 140-some countries that are assessed to 100th place. So, the rest of the world is doing a better job, it seems, of addressing gender parity than China is. Now, as you saw in the video, one of the big problems in these ads is the sexual objectification of women. On the one hand, ads asking for certain physical requirements that have nothing to do with the job. Women of a certain age, women of a certain physical appearance. And so, for example, the one of the ads posted on the job search website, Chilian Xiaopan, for a clothes sales associate in Beijing read, they wanted a high school diploma or above, female, 18 to 30. You can't do this job if you're older than that. A net height of 163 centimeters or higher, trim figure, and aesthetically pleasing. So just like blatant objectification of these women. An ad for a train conductor wanted, the job title said, "We want fashionable and beautiful high-speed train conductors." It's funny in a way, but it's serious because it shows you that it just excludes whole categories of women. Now, in many ways, the most blatant stuff was when it came to objectifying current female employees as a way of attracting male employees. And this, it got awful. And this is the private sector stuff. So, Alibaba talks repeatedly about the beautiful girls, the goddesses who are working there. Come men, apply. There was an article in Tencent's official recruitment WeChat account where a male employee is quoted as saying, "The reason I joined Tencent originated from a primal impulse. It was mainly because the ladies at Human Resources that interviewed me were very pretty." Now, you can imagine when you entice people in on these grounds, when basically the company is saying it's okay to look at women as sexual objects, this is an invitation to sexual harassment. This creates a hostile working environment. Now, what has China's official response been? I mentioned that the law, in particular the labor law and the advertising law, prohibit gender discrimination. So, we're okay there. But the definition is vague. So there's nothing clarifying that gender discrimination means you don't sexually objectify your female workforce. That it means you don't, specify certain physical characteristics of the women you want. So there's a vagueness which makes enforcement of the law in these areas more difficult. But I would say probably the biggest problem is the passivity of official enforcement agencies. So you never get proactive enforcement of the law. What Human Rights Watch did here is not rocket science. China is a technologically sophisticated country. It could have downloaded the ads. It could have done a search for the offending terms. It could have done exactly what we did. It doesn't do that. So it basically waits for somebody to complain. And when they do, the response tends to be minimal. Sometimes they'll tell the offending company or agency to pull down a particular ad. But you don't get, broad orders, no more of this kind of stuff. It's just, take down this offending ad. In rare cases, there will be, a fine, but a modest fine. A fine that is so small that it's an easy cost of doing business. Not the kind of fine that would send a signal to the company or to the industry that this is not an appropriate way to conduct your business. Now, quite apart from enforcement from above, one obvious way you enforce the law in this area is from below. You enable people to complain. You enable activists to campaign around this issue. You allow women to say this is not the way we want our society to be organized. But China is much more concerned with constraining activism than it is with solving the problems that are the object of that activism. And so, as you know, women's rights activists are harassed. The most famous example was the Feminist Five, who endured detention, ongoing harassment and surveillance. And while their focus was sexual harassment and putting stickers on the buses to combat that, these are the same people who would be combating gender discrimination. And the message is, we'll take care of this from above. We don't want any activism from below. And this is obviously a much broader problem. This is, China's approach to activism across the board. But this is an illustration of the cost because it's part of why this kind of gender discrimination is so blatant. Now, the we wrote to the government and said, these are our findings. What are you doing about it? In typical form, the government didn't write back. So, what we're hoping it does is, if not explicitly, at least behind closed doors, acknowledges that this is a problem and takes steps to solve it. This is not difficult to solve if it has the political will. We also wrote to the companies, and the only company that wrote back was Chilean Chopin, which I think it's a website that caters to sort of high-end job seekers. And it said, we have a policy against this and we enforce it. And what we found is that they do occasionally, they run searches and they find offending ads and they pull them down. But it's a pretty weak effort because it is easy to evade the searches by just using cognates or different symbols. And so we found a lot of unaddressed evasion on that job search site by companies that post their jobs there. Jack Ma of Alibaba likes to speak publicly about the company's commitment to its women employees, but Alibaba didn't bother responding to our queries about the report. So what I would conclude with is that this is not an issue with which the Chinese government disagrees with us regarding our goals. We should be on the same page that gender discrimination in employment is wrong. It has the theoretical commitment to fight this, but it needs to go beyond lip service and to show the genuine and effective dedication to eradicating this serious problem. And as for Chinese companies, it's not enough for them to hide behind weak law enforcement. They have a duty on their own to end, not to perpetuate, this kind of blatant gender discrimination. So I will stop there and would welcome your questions.
Great. Okay. So we'll take questions from the floor now. If you could identify, when I call you, if you could identify your news organization, give your name and identify your organization, news or otherwise. I'll call on my colleague Sherry. Put her hand up first.
Yeah, actually, do you want to speak first? Yeah, okay.
Oh.
Okay, why don't we, let's just take a moment.
Oh, okay. We're gonna, before we get to questions, we have a.
Okay.
Go ahead. Do you need, yeah.
Thank you for human rights. Does it work?
Just have to.
Test me.
Thank you for the invitation to talk on this occasion. Over the past 6 years, I do my PhD in filmmaking about gender and sexuality. And when I was an activist in China, the situation I often encountered is that people often ask me, how do you feel? Why are they asked by male colleagues saying that? What do you think? That's very particular, gendered environment we are working with. And I did very careful research of the Human Rights Watch's report and would like to share a little bit my specific ideas on the report. The first thing is, I think, of course, Kenneth already talked a lot about the government obligation to eliminate gender violation and improve gender equality through law enforcement and the regulations in particular. So I would like to give a few of the comments on specifically what the companies can do more to improve the working environment for working women, considering the low awareness on gender equality in private sectors in China. First, I would like to say to introduce anti-sexual harassment provision and regulations into staff training, which can be done by companies and make gender equality related documents to be available to every staff member in the company, and also set up a specific section or office within the company to deal with sexual harassment and gender violation related complaints. And also trained company management staffs on gender equality and anti-gender discrimination. We often see gender equality training is set up for working women only, rather than to hire management and men, which I think is totally wrong. The higher management and male colleagues should receive more training on the gender equality. And the fourth point for the companies to do is to provide platforms and resources for working women to do self-organizing and capability building. And for NGOs and civil society groups, they should follow initiate a legal case against these companies who publish gender-biased job advertisements. And for NGOs, Chinese and transnational companies, government, and UN bodies, I think they should provide platforms and resources for working women's self-expression and self-organizing, because that's a key mechanism for working women to gain structural support in developing self-confidence and autonomy in the working environment. And therefore, they will have the initiative power to fight against gender discrimination and sexual violations. Last year, when I visiting the New York University, speaking with film scholars, a Chinese female professor there discussed the gender problems in the filmmaking and intellectual communities with me, and she reminds me, I think I will remember forever in my life, that is, we are in a gendered biased culture, and discrimination is our daily life working environment. Nothing new. But however, we have to ask ourselves today, why do we still allow this discrimination and violation happen to us? I think that's a very good question for me to remind myself in future also. And finally, I want to highlight human rights reports one particular point, that is, government bodies should not suppress feminist voices and actions in the country. Therefore, we as feminists, I know there are some other feminists in this press release conference occasion, but she probably does not feel comfortable to say. But as feminists, I think we can activate our agencies and work with other groups in solidarity to defend gender equality in all fields and around the world if the government is not suppress our action and collective expression. That's all what I want to share. Thank you.
Could you identify yourself again? Because people are, I'm not sure everyone knows who you are.
Okay. My name is Zheng Jingyan. I was working in the field of HIV/AIDS, environmental protection, and human rights defense since 2001. In 2012, I moved to Hong Kong to do a PhD in the field of gender and sexuality, social activism, and state-society relationship. Now, basically, now I already finished my earned my PhD, so I'm a writer and the filmmaker. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, now back to the Q&A.
Thank you.
Sherry, you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you. I'm Sheridan Prasso. I work for Bloomberg News, and I apologize for my cold. I want to ask you, and I get to ask this because I'm a woman, and obviously I would not be in favor of gender discrimination, but when you cited some statistics about the real life implications, you said there's a diminishment of women in the workforce, slight, but you could also say that's because women are, improving economically and choosing to stay home, or other factors as well. Could you tell us how does it really translate on the ground? What is so bad for women in the workplace as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways the most dramatic statistics are the World Economic Forum ones, because they show, how China is doing compared to other countries. And here you have China, which is known for its economic progress, being a real leader, and it's just, falling behind the pack when it comes to gender parity. And so this means, reduced employment opportunities, it means reduced pay, it means a reduced possibility of a professional life or employment life for women. And this adds up to huge injustice and a huge loss of potential for millions upon millions of women. So even a small change in a percentage in a country the size of China can have vast human consequences.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back there. Thank you. And please identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Elaine, and I'm from AFP. You've touched on this already, but sort of at a government level. But so we got this response from Alibaba saying their defense is that they do have these anti-discrimination laws, equal recruitment, equal opportunities. So is it very much the same case with the government, like weak law enforcement and vague language in the policies and sort of a passive role in going forward with these complaints? Like, what's your analysis about? Is it a discrepancy between, policies paying lip service and also like what actually gets implemented at these like private companies?
Yeah, the bottom line for both the government and for private companies is that it's not enough to have nice, broad policy language. If you have an anti-discrimination provision in your annual report and feel like you've done your job, you're failing miserably. And what's needed is serious implementation. So, are they looking at their job ads to make sure that they comply with their policy? Are they taking remedial steps beyond just taking an ad down? Are they disciplining people who engage in gender discrimination? Is the leadership talking about this? I mean, frankly, the most important way to send a signal to those in a company is for the CEO to talk about it. Is this something he leaves to the HR department as a kind of a little trivial concern on the side? Or is this something that, the CEO thinks is important? And so, leadership means moving proactively. It means, making sure there's a real penalty that is paid when you have offenders. It doesn't mean just publishing a nice line in your annual report.
Other questions? Yeah, over here.
I'm with VOA. There are a lot of the foreign companies in China. Have you found anything in that regard? Role model, if you will, American companies, British companies, to be a good model in China's setting. Have you found anything in terms of violating the problem you're talking about among the American companies? Not necessarily American companies, foreign companies, and the Taiwanese companies.
Thank you. We did not find this kind of gender discrimination in the ads of international companies operating in China. We didn't look, this is not a global survey, so I can't speak to the company's practices around the world, and I'm sure we'll find offenders elsewhere. But we did look at ads posted by international companies operating in China and did not find this kind of gender discrimination. Now, why is that? I mean, I think what it suggests is that international companies face serious pressure from below. If an international company operating in China put an ad like this up, it would be lambasted in social media back home. One consequence of China stifling discussion of these issues on social media here in China is that companies that are Chinese companies, not to mention the Chinese government, does not face this kind of social pressure from below. You can have a big Chinese company engaging in this kind of practices and they don't really pay it a reputational price. So that is, a direct consequence of the Chinese government's prioritization of the suppression of activism over the suppression of the concerns of the activists.
Thank you. Other questions? Over here.
Hi, this is Kenneth Roth from BBC. Given the fact that maternity benefits is one of the main factors behind the discrimination against women, do you think the two children policy actually worsened the situation?
This is not the first time that we've encountered people who cite maternity benefits as a rationale for gender discrimination. I mean, just to give you an example, probably a decade or more ago, Human Rights Watch did a report on gender discrimination in assembly plants in Mexico, just across the US-Mexican border. And one of the companies came back and said, of course we discriminate. Women take maternity leave, they're too expensive. That answer lasted about 5 minutes before the public pressure forced them to change. And not everybody has the same costs. Not everybody is going to be as easy. But one of the duties of an employer is to treat people equally. And you may have a person with a disability. You may have a woman who wants to take maternity leave. You may have a male who has to take care of a family member or an aging parent. This is just part of what being an employer is not discriminating on those bases and not allowing those kind of personal circumstances to become a justification for discrimination. So, yes, you can rationalize this to say women cost us more, but it's the responsibility of the government to say that's not a good excuse. And even if that is true in a particular case, you still have a duty to treat women equally.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
I have to apologise for a cold as well. My name's Hans and I'm a civil rights activist. You spoke about how this is an example of China's blatant behaviour. Would you say that the current situation is a reflection of its overall human rights approach, or rather approach to human rights, and that is it has this approach of if we don't acknowledge a problem, it doesn't exist, and therefore gender discrimination in employment is a reflection of China's wider human rights landscape and its blatant disregard for human equality and rights in general?
Yeah, I mean, I would put it a little bit differently. I do think it reflects the broader context, but I don't think it's a matter of saying, oh, if we don't acknowledge a problem, it doesn't exist. I think it's rather a widespread fear of the activism. Xi Jinping presents himself as a strong man, as a powerful leader, and this is a guy who's running scared of the Chinese people. He goes to sleep every night terrified that the Chinese people are somehow going to organize and band together, and he will face a large-scale uprising of discontent over some issue. And so if you look at everything he has done for the last several years is designed to nip in the bud any possibility of a large-scale movement of discontent. And so the suppression of activists in the realm of women's rights is part and parcel with the suppression of activism across the board, or any kind of public discussion of these issues that could catch on, or any kind of organized discontent. And in a society as vast and complicated as China's, it's dangerous to have this centralized authority where increasingly one man makes all the decisions, because it's too complex a country to do that. You need to run a country well to be able to be open to the articulation of problems from society itself. And if you're afraid of the Chinese people, you're not going to learn about these problems, and they're going to fester rather than be solved. And so I do think that this method of increasingly one-man governance, coupled with increasing suppression of any opportunity or any attempt at organized dissent, is leading China in a very dangerous direction. And you can look at this particular report as one illustration of a much broader problem that China is facing today.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, Shelley Banjo with Bloomberg as well. Why would these private companies need to do anything about this if the public sector positions also advertise this? So if the government can do it and it's fine, then why would the private sector need to pay any attention to this? They're not going to get in trouble if it's okay if the government can do it.
Yeah, well, that's exactly our point. In other words, if you look at what the government is implicitly saying about this, it's saying, yes, we have this theoretical law against gender discrimination, but if you look at their actions, and actions here speak louder than words, they're not doing anything about it. One, they're not enforcing the law in a serious way. Two, they are themselves violating the law blatantly, and they're setting a completely negative example. So it should be no surprise in that context that private companies do the same. And so, if China is really going to address it, it has to, one, enforce the law, two, get its own employment agencies to stop. And that is really all a prerequisite to then moving on to the private sector and getting it to stop.
Okay. Oh, there was a question here. To the microphone.
Kenneth,
Yes.
Han Dongfang from China Labor Bulletin.
Yeah.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One is, are you planning to translate it into Chinese
Yes.
and circulate it on the social media? Good. Second, I realized that starting from middle 2015, it was Xi Jinping who pushed for the mass organizations reform, including the Youth League, Women's Federation, and official trade union to reform. And late that year, 2015, the trade union reform became the priority. So I realized that in this report, there's no analysis on these organizations, particularly the trade union and the Women's Federation, their effort or their failure, and there's no letter to them. Why is that?
Yeah, but that's a fair point. And I mean, these official institutions obviously can play an important role in addressing these problems. I guess we treated them as an extension of the government rather than as autonomous agencies, because it probably is largely an accurate description. But you're right that as official bodies, they could play a useful role here, and we would certainly appeal to them to join us in trying to address this problem.
We have time for another few questions. Yes, over here.
Hello. It's a good idea, by the way.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, I'd
please?
like to do that. I'm Jessica Park from Professional Wills Limited. Please remember that name. So anyway, thanks for the push. So if 10 years ago, whatever it was, we would put in the same ads in Hong Kong newspapers. I forget when it changed. Did it change from the sex discrimination ordinance? But a very short period of time ago, we were doing the same things here in Hong Kong. And I suppose around the world in modern Western, civilized, if that's a good idea, countries, we still have these problems. So when we look into China and the progress that China's made, which is tremendous in trying to bring women up in an equal workforce to the men, they've done a tremendously good job. Is the Human Rights Watch, your organization, the best organization to try to get this message across to the Chinese leaders? I sometimes worry about that. And it just makes me wonder, why do we have this problem in the first place? We go to schools all over the world, and we have schools for girls and schools for boys, and we're just riddled with a separation of the roles of men and women from the beginning of birth. And so I'm just wondering how we cope with all of that. And then when you get them into employment, you sometimes want to have separations of roles. And we've got sex discrimination within employment. How do we manage that? And it's an interesting experiment, putting men and women working together. So there's a lot of mixed up feelings here. And the passing a law is great. We should promote it. There's very complex issues. I'm not quite sure who should be trying to encourage the Chinese governments to make these changes.
Well, I mean, in terms of why Human Rights Watch, I actually think this is an area where we might find common ground with the government, because at least theoretically, it's committed to this as an issue. I do, if you talk about sort of historically China's treatment of women, one of the great advances of the Communist Party was to bring women into the workforce, and there was a recognition that China couldn't advance economically by ignoring half of its population, and that this was enormous potential that it could enlist. And that that was one of the good things you could say about communist rule. Now, they seem to be moving away from that, and we don't know exactly why. They're not talking to us at this stage. As we speculated about it, I mean, two things come to mind, both of which point toward the government actually, preferring women these days to stay home and have babies. One is the surplus male population. And so, every unmarried woman is yet another surplus male. And so there clearly is this desire to kind of get women at least married. But there's also this concern with an aging population and the need to supplement that with more babies, which again pushes women home. So, you should ask the government about this. I mean, I'm kind of curious how they would respond. But as we think about it, these, two countervailing interests of the government may be pushing it to be less attentive to enforcing gender discrimination in employment.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Someone else have a question? Oh, okay, great. Okay, please go ahead. We're running out of time.
Hi, I'm Nikki from Nikkei Asia Review. I have two questions. You mentioned a lot of tech giants in China. Do you find this problem is more severe among the tech companies compared to other companies? If that is the case, can you name a few companies that have the worst situation? And I noticed like many Chinese tech companies are listed overseas. Do you think the investor or other force outside China would change the situation or at least improve the situation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not in a position to identify the worst. We didn't really try to do that. So you have to you can look at the examples we give in the report, but these are illustrative examples. They're not our effort to identify who's the worst employer. So we didn't go there. In terms of, what is the pressure on companies, sadly, investor pressure tends to be more satisfied with token gestures. And so they, will tend to look at what you say in your annual report or your official human rights policy, your social responsibility policy, and be, many investors are satisfied with that fairly superficial analysis. It's consumer pressure that pushes companies to live up to these principles. And because Chinese companies, at least within their consumer base in China, are largely immune from that kind of unfettered consumer pressure, they misbehave. And so, I mean, that's why I come back to if the government were really serious about prioritizing ending this problem, they would enable at least social media discussion of it. But they're terrified of allowing unfettered social media discussion about social problems, so it doesn't happen.
Because you did a lot of research on the ads, and can you identify a few sectors that have the worst problem, not the company?
Yeah, and I'm not in a position to, I mean, we can try to, I can put you in touch with our experts to see if they have a sense. We didn't make that assessment in the report, so I'm not comfortable kind of offering that off the top of my head here.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you all for your questions, and I'm sure there will be people that Ken can put you in touch with to follow up with. We want to thank him and give you a little token of our appreciation from the FCC.
At least you didn't ask me to dance. That's good.
Thank you all, and there's extra reports available.